Okay, so we're going to do an AO2 essay on is virtue ethics different to deontological and teleological ethical systems. Okay, so let's start out by really discussing the meaning of this question. Is virtue ethics different to teleological and deontological ethical theories? And what virtue ethicists would want you to say is yes, it is. And really, that's the purpose of virtue ethics, if you like. Well, certainly its modern revival is that it is different to teleological and deontological ethical theories. So modern virtue ethics, which was revived in the kind of 20th century, was revived by this person, G.M. Anscombe, and she kind of said, let's go back to the kind of Aristotelian virtue ethics, because she disliked what had happened to ethics in that it had become a choice between teleological theories and deontological theories. Now, her problem with teleological ethical theories, which obviously are theories which determine if an action is right or wrong based on their consequences, she thought that was wrong because you could really justify anything, or you could justify things which were done for a bad reason. You could say, but as long as they had a good outcome, that thing was moral. So, for example, you could be doing something, for a really nasty reason, but if by chance it happened to have a good outcome, then that thing becomes moral. And she thought that, if you didn't really think about intentions or anything, then that was a bit silly. And she didn't like deontological ethical theories because she said, somebody to come up with rules has to have authority to make rules. And who has that authority? Only God has that authority. But what happens if there is no God? And so she didn't like the idea that we should come up with our own rules either. And so what she said is, let's return to virtue ethics. And the reason that she said that is because virtue ethics has a different focus to teleological and deontological ethical theories. So teleological and deontological ethical theories are what are known as act-centered theories. In other words, a person is determined to be moral or not based on the actions that they do. So, for example, teleological theory, utilitarianism, is act-centered because a person is good or bad depending on if the actions that they do result in happiness. So they're act-centered, whereas virtue ethics has a very different focus. Virtue ethics is what is called agent-centered. In other words, agent-centered theories focus on the person and the character of the person. And so instead of saying that a person is defined as good or bad based on their actions, what agent-centered ethical theories say is that actually you become a good person first, and then you will automatically do good things. So it focuses on the individual's character rather than their actions. And so what this question is all about is it's wanting you to focus on the difference really between the fact that teleological and deontological theories are act-centered, judge a person by their actions, as opposed to virtue ethics, which is agent-centered, judges a person based on their character rather than their individual actions. So in a previous essay on the strengths and weaknesses of virtue ethics, we discussed the structure of writing an AO2 essay, so I won't really go over that again here. But what I do suggest is that what you do is you first of all think about what you're going to conclude to the question, then start off with the side of the argument that you disagree with, so that you can say a weak point and then counter that by saying, however, a much stronger argument is such and such, and then by the time you come to your conclusion, the examiner should know which side you sit on because you've shown a stronger side, and therefore you've shown that line of argument, which is what we want. So we'll start off, because I'm going to conclude that they are different, that virtue ethics and teleological, deontological ethical theories are really different. I'm going to start off with argument that it is not different. And so I would use a sentence starter like some people or a few people, or a weak argument is that some people would say that virtue ethics is just the same as, say, deontological ethics. For example, Walter Schaller says, because once you've decided on what virtues you want to develop, surely then you come up with your own set of rules, even if that's subconsciously. You come up with a set of rules which you follow to ensure that you act virtuously. So, for example, if I want to develop the virtue of honesty, then surely, at least subconsciously, I always follow the rule, do not lie. And so what Schaller is basically saying is that virtue ethics and deontological ethics are basically the same, because what you're doing in virtue ethics is you're deciding what kind of person you want to be, and then you set yourself rules which you will always follow to ensure you become that kind of person. And so what he's saying is that virtue ethics relies on you following a set of rules, and so therefore it's just the same as deontological ethics. However, what I would counter that with is saying that actually most people would say that deontological ethics and and virtue ethics are actually different, because deontological ethics is act-centered, whereas virtue ethics is agent-centered. So straight away here, I'm getting in that key difference between deontological, teleological, and virtue ethics by showing that they're different based on one being act-centered and the other being agent-centered. That's the key difference. So what I would go on to say is that deontological theories judge whether an individual is moral or not based on their actions, and if their actions conform to a set of rules. However, virtue ethics is not concerned about individual actions. It's actually concerned with an individual's character. And so the focus is different. It's very different. Deontological judges a person based on whether or not they break a set of rules. Virtue ethics, not bothered about that, bothered about what's the person's character like. And so, illustrating that with an example, remember, an example in every paragraph. A deontologist, for example, may have a rule that says you must never allow or carry out euthanasia. And so if somebody does that, according to that deontological theory, that person is then a bad person because they've broken that rule. However, virtue ethics wouldn't judge a person on one action. They wouldn't say, oh yes, that person is now a bad person. What they would do is they judge a person on their whole life, on their character, what's their character like. So virtue ethics allows an individual to in one situation it might be that euthanasia is actually something that a virtuous person would do, whereas in another it wouldn't. And so they have completely different focus points. Deontological theories, or teleological for that matter, would judge somebody on an individual action, whereas virtue ethics wouldn't do that. It wouldn't judge you on whether you break a rule or not. And so this is a real counter to Schaller's argument, because you're not following a set of rules, and virtue ethics wouldn't judge you on following a set of rules. It judges you on your character, and what your character is like. And so what they would say is that actually you would automatically know what to do if you're a virtuous person. And so very, very different focus points. Now the 2 points that I've just made there, you could make them about teleological theories as well. Obviously you would just change from following a set of rules to doing something which has a good outcome. So here again, because in my conclusion I'm going to be disagreeing with this point, I'm going to be saying it is a weak argument. And so a weak argument to suggest that virtue ethics is the same as teleological ethics is that, like teleological ethical theories, virtue ethics focuses on an end. So teleological ethics determine if a person, or an action for that matter, is good or bad based on its outcome. And if a person is good or bad based on the outcome of their actions. And virtue ethics determines if a person is good or bad based on whether or not they have the desirable characteristics to reach a particular end. And that end obviously is eudaimonia. So for virtue ethics, a good person is somebody who is going to reach eudaimonia, and for teleological ethical theories, a good person is somebody whose actions have a desired outcome. So some people would say they're basically the same thing. So to illustrate that with an example, utilitarians would say someone is a good person if their actions result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Foot and Aristotle would say that a person is good if they've developed the character to reach eudaimonia, and if they contribute to their society reaching eudaimonia. And similarly, McIntyre would say someone is good if they are contributing to the well-being of their society. So you can see there that some people would say, well actually, they're both teleological in a sense, because the teleological theories are judging somebody on the outcome of their actions, and virtue ethics is judging somebody to be good or bad based on an outcome of them developing certain characteristics. So really they are the same, some people would say. However, as a counter to that, most people would say that they are different. Teleological theories and virtue ethics are different because teleological theories give answers to ethical dilemmas, whereas virtue ethics does not. So they're not the same. They're not the same thing. They might have certain elements which are similar in that, you know, they both focus on an end, for example, but they're not the same. And I suppose that's a good key point to illustrate in this essay. You know, if you want to access those higher marks, yes, to some extent they are. You know, virtue ethics is similar to deontological and teleological ethical theories, but it's not the same. So, you know, it is really different. It isn't the same. It might have similar points, or parts of it might be similar, but it is different. So, you know, to illustrate this point, for example, utilitarianism determines the morality of an action based on whether or not it results in happiness. So, for example, giving to charity is moral, but murder is not. Giving you answers to dilemmas, so, you know, should I murder? Well, only if it results in happiness. That would be what a utilitarian would say. However, virtue ethics isn't concerned with giving you answers. It wouldn't say that. It wouldn't say, you know, in this situation, murder is good or not. What it would say is that something a virtuous person would do? So remember, very, very different focuses. Virtue ethics, agent-centred, says a person who is virtuous will automatically do good actions, whereas teleological theories, act-centred, your morality is determined by your actions. And so very, very different focus points. And so in virtue ethics, actions are not right or wrong, they're only likely or unlikely to be done by virtuous people. So it doesn't give you an answer to an ethical dilemma, whereas teleological and deontological theories, for that matter, would do. And so therefore they have a different purpose and focus, and so they are different. You know, linking back to the question, they are different. They've got a different, you know, it's got a different purpose, different focus. Just to, as an aside point, there are a series of other videos on Mr. Gilbert's guides applying virtue ethics, and so if you want to watch them, that will really clear up for you the idea that as an agent-centred theory, it does not give you an answer to an ethical dilemma, but rather what it does is it gets you to think about, well, is this something that a virtuous person would do? Yes or no, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the action is good or bad. All it means is it something a virtuous person would do? So very, very different focuses again. Okay, and then final set of points now is that, you know, some people would say that Foote's principle, that actions done using a characteristic must be done for a good outcome for those characteristics to be considered as virtues, is basically the same as the teleological principle that actions which have a good outcome are good. Now here I'm focusing on a part of Foote's theory. If you got an essay question on this, read the question carefully. If it's asking you to focus, it could say something like, is Aristotle's virtue ethics really different to teleological, deontological theories? Well, obviously there you're going to need to tailor it towards Aristotle. But if it doesn't, you know, you can bring in different elements from the different theories that we've looked at. So McIntyre, Foote, Aristotle. Here I'm focusing on a principle out of Foote's theory. And so here, you know, some people would say that they are similar because they're both based on you doing good things, you know, actions that have good outcomes. So, for example, Foote would say that using courage to rob a bank does not make that courage a virtue, as robbing a bank has a bad outcome. What she would say is that you would need to do something which has a good outcome using courage for that courage to be considered a virtue. So, I don't know, for example, jumping in front of a car to save somebody who's going to get run over, you know, that's courageous and is done for a good outcome to save that person's life, and so therefore that courage then would be considered as a virtue. And so therefore theoretically here the morality of an action and individuals is based on their outcome of the actions, and so they are the same as teleological. Teleological and virtue ethics here kind of do have similar principles. However, a very strong counter-argument to that would be to suggest that virtue ethics and teleological theories are very different, in that teleological theories, your intentions don't really matter. As long as you're doing something which results in a good outcome, it doesn't really matter whether you meant to do that or whether you wanted to do that. Whereas in virtue ethics, intentions really do matter. And so, coming back to foot again, for foot, you actually have to intend to and want to act virtuously to become virtuous. So, being virtuous isn't just determined by the outcome of your action, but it's actually determined by the reason that you did it. So, going back to the previous example there, if I jump in front of a car to save somebody, if that's my intention, is to save somebody, then I'm using that courage. That courage then is a virtue. Whereas if I didn't mean to save them, I don't know, I'm sure you could think of a reason why somebody would jump in front. Maybe they wanted to just be famous. Then that courage there, isn't a virtue. And so the difference is, for teleological theories, it really doesn't matter what your intention is as long as the outcome is good. Whereas for foot, your intention really does matter. You have to mean to and want to act virtuously to be virtuous. And similarly for McIntyre, carrying out actions for their internal goods will develop virtues. And so this is like carrying out an action with a particular intention. And so very, very different to teleological theories in that it's not just about the outcome of the action, but it's about doing something with the intention of being virtuous. So very, very different. And so to conclude then, remember, I always think it's a good idea to start your conclusion with, in conclusion, the evidence would suggest. So I would say that virtue ethics is really different, linking to the question, to teleological, deontological, ethical approaches. Mainly, so here I'm just highlighting what's my main point, mainly because virtue ethics is agent-centred, whereas the others are act-centred, so have a different focus to them. So, make sure that you're always linking back to the question, you're using those examples, and really, just remember, tailor the answer to the question. Other kinds of questions you could get here is, they could say, it could focus on teleological or deontological, so it could say, is virtue ethics really different to teleological theories? Well, obviously the most of the points in your essay would be about the difference between virtue ethics and teleological ethical theories. However, you could bring in stuff about deontological ethics as well, as long as it's tailored towards the question. So, you might say something like, well, it's more similar to deontological ethics than teleological ethics. So as long as you're tailoring it to the question there, using those words from the question, that should be fine. So hopefully that has been helpful.